Density is a embroidery property that deals with how closely the stitches are packed into one another. It is a property that I hope you don't have to deal with very often. I hope the defaults work for you the majority of the time, but occasionally you will need to go in and adjust that, be it because of a different type of thread, a thicker thread, a metallic thread, or maybe a thinner thread where you're dealing with finer details, or perhaps you're trying to deal with a different kind of material or different type of application, or maybe 3D foam. All of those you may need to adjust density, and that is the adjustment of the space between the stitches. Here I have some lettering. Density applies to lots of different things, but I have some lettering here, and I've removed a lot of the defaults that I think will hopefully work very well for you most of the time, just so that we can get a better idea of what we're looking at. So I'm going to zoom in really tight in here. I'm going to go into Object Properties, and we're going to be looking under Top Stitching. I've turned off Underlay. I've turned off auto features. I've turned off a lot of the defaults just to get this to show up kind of very cleanly for us. And what I want to look at is this density setting right here. It is also right here on the property bar. So I'm going to close this since we've got access to it in a couple of different places just to give us a little bit more visibility. And it is set to 4 points. And what that is, it is the distance between, so let's get the ruler. I'm going to click and drag from here to here, and it is 4 points. I'm going to do it again, from here to here, and it is 4 points. Density is the measurement of the distance between stitch lines that are traveling the same direction. Sounds a little, what? But we'll look at it in a satin and we'll look at it in a fill. Oftentimes it's easier to measure if you want to take the ruler and measure it. Now you've got access to object properties for wireframe designs. You're probably not going to do what I'm about to do. But to better explain it, we're going to measure it with the ruler. If for some reason you get an expanded design and it doesn't have properties because it's expanded, but you want to see what the digitizer was doing, this is a way to go in and kind of measure what some other digitizer was doing just to see how they made stuff work. So here I've added arrows so that we can better see the direction of these stitch lines. So let's zoom in even a little bit tighter yet. And so we can see that this one is coming from left to right, and then it steps down, going the opposite direction, and then it comes from left to right again. So because we're measuring the distance between stitch lines traveling the same direction, we're going to come from here to here, and that's 4 points. And if we select that element, we can see that that's what that density is. 4 points from here to here. Now, if I'm trying to measure this in the middle, I'm not going from here to here or from here to here because those are going in different directions. I've got to go from one all the way to the next that's traveling that same direction, 4 points. And that's why I think it's a little bit easier to see on the edge. And it's going to be easier to measure on straight areas. If I zoom out and I look at some of these curve areas, we've got short stitches, which is alternating. If those were off, it would have been really tight in the middle. So the straighter areas are the easier places to see this. Now, if I was dealing with a fill, and let's straighten this out to something a little bit easier to see. If I come in, I'm going to turn off this underlay real quick. If I look, we've got lots of parallel lines, but if I measure from here to here, I'm only going to get 2. And that's, again, because even though we've got these lines that are even, we're still traveling in different directions. So again, a little bit easier if I measure closer to the edge where I can see. Whenever I have these points, I know I'm getting from one to the next that's going the same stitch direction. So we have 4, Here we have another 4. So how do I change density, and what do I change it to? Well, I change density by changing that number, and the bigger the number, the farther apart my stitches get. What's a good density? Well, that kind of depends on what you're doing. In embroidery, length equals loft. The longer the stitch, the more it stays up out of the fabric. I know anybody that's watched me talk about density before has heard me say that, but it's absolutely true. So the longer stitches kind of need their little stitch neighbors to be a little bit close together to kind of hold themselves up and look nice. Longer stitches, they've got a little more play in them, so their neighbors kind of hold them looking nice. Now, if I'm dealing with smaller stitches, thinner satins, those kinds of things, if I keep trying to bunch in the stitches, they'll kind of pucker and bubble over each other, and that's not what I want. So having thinner stitches a little bit farther apart helps. So for longer stitches, for wider satins, you want a tighter density where that number is going to be a little bit smaller. You want the space between them to be less. You want them to be closer together. And for smaller stitches, you want the number to be bigger. You want them to be a little bit farther apart so that they don't kind of buckle all over each other. Let's look at actually how to change that. So if I change this density number, let's change it to something that's really visible on screen, 20. Well, that's how I change it. I changed that number and wow, that did change. I could also do it in properties. I could go into top stitching, which is where it's found, and I could change this number. Now I'm going to change it back to 4. Whole number changes are very rare for me. Often it will be just fractional. So I might go from a 4 to a 4.2, something like that. Now, here's the tricky bit. This one, because all of my stitches are relatively the same length, could probably get away with just one density setting for the whole lettering element. However, look at this one. I've got thins, I've got thicks, I've got thinner areas that need a lighter density where those stitches are farther apart, and I've got thicker areas that need a tighter density where the stitches are closer together. Okay, well, that is where auto density can be a big help. Auto density adjusts the density of the element based on the average stitch line length of an area. So it will go through, and where it's thinner, it will space them apart a little bit. Where it's thicker and has the longer stitches, it will bring those tighter together to keep the neighbors holding up the stitches well. That's what auto density does. It's really handy. It is on by default in your software. It should work really well for you. I actually had to turn a lot of stuff off to get good, bad examples for this video. So right now, this has a just standard density of 4. And if I turn on auto density and hit apply, you can see those stitches just shifted a little bit. So let's see if we can find a really good example. So if I zoom in here a little bit tighter, where this gets really thin, you can see that these stitches here are farther apart than these stitches here. So where the stitches are longer, the density is tighter. Where the stitches are smaller, the density is much lighter. The stitches are farther apart. Tighter where it's longer, farther apart where it's thinner. Now, this isn't exactly fair. We're dealing on the inside of a curve. You can even see that short stitches are kind of kicking on now and then. This is pretty close to that threshold. So be aware, we're looking at the inside of the curve, which can throw that off a little bit. If you look at the straighter areas here and here and here, you can see that difference. And if I measure, it may be too fractional to see well. This is 4, and yeah, it's too hard to see on screen. But if we go into the properties of auto density, we can see what it's doing. So anytime you have this ellipsis by a property, it is the properties of that property. And here I can see the table that auto density is using. So when the column or the multi-stitch line element is very, very thin, it does a 4.7 density. A little bit thicker, a 4.0. That's a pretty big jump, but I mean, you're doubling the size of the stitches here, so you can see how that might change. From 20 to 30, we go down to a 3.8. From 30 to 40, 3.7. From 40 to 50, a 3.6, and then it evens out. Why would it do that? Well, when we start getting larger areas, we start using the fill for stitch lines greater than. And when that happens, our fills all have one stitch length. So it's not varying anymore after it crosses a certain point. Once that happens, we can use the same density because our stitch lengths aren't longer. So that's why that kind of plateaus at a point. So use fills for stitch lines greater than is meant to keep your stitches in your fabric if it's something that's going to get a lot of use. If it is something that is going to get very little use and is more decorative, you can adjust those settings and you can deal with longer stitches. And if that's the case, you may need to adjust that table. So I just made this bigger so that we can see when this fill for stitch lines greater than is kicking in. And you can see as it gets to a point, it's thinner, thinner, getting thicker, thicker, thicker. Here we hit that threshold and it's becoming... Yep, right at that 80 point, it's becoming that fill. So where it gets to where it's starting to plateau is right in here. And that's okay because we get to a point where all of our stitch lengths are the same. Auto density is really nice for satin stitch elements where you may have some thick and thin. You don't really want to think about it, deal with, okay, what do I do here? What do I do there? What do I do for this element? Okay, this element's changing. How do I navigate that change? Just have auto density deal with it so that you don't have to. Now, auto density is less great for just straight fills. With just straight fills, you've got the same stitch length throughout the form, and auto density isn't based on stitch length, it's based on stitch line length. So all the way across the form, it doesn't care how many stitches are in there, it's measuring that line all the way across the form. Okay. So for just standard fills, I do just a standard density. And I tend to go around 3.8, which is what the default is. I can adjust a little up and down from there. I may go down to maybe 3.5. That feels a little tight to me, but I have been known to do it in the past. I might go up to a 4, maybe a 4.2. That might get a little loose on some things, but this is going to depend on, what your project is and what your thread is. I mean, all the things that I'm saying are kind of based on 40 weight thread. If you switch to a 60 weight or 75 weight, you got to have those stitches closer together because the thread's so much thinner. Or if you go down to a 30 weight, I got to spread them out because the thread itself just got that much thicker. Okay. So what happens if I get the wrong density? Well, it's either going to look really gappy on your fabric. Okay, that could be an underlay issue. That could be a topping issue if I'm dealing with a really textured fabric. But I can also sometimes deal with some of that with density. What if I get it too tight? Why don't I just pack all those stitches in and just cover it really good, like a really thick layer of paint? Well, that creates a lot of ripples and puckers and really not good looking embroidery. So I tend to not do that. I tend to deal with a lot of things via underlay and then try to go as light as I can get away with my top stitching just to have the most stable stitching that I can get. Honestly, and I know I keep saying this, but the default should work fairly well for you. If you are using auto density and you find, I like the range. I like that it's dealing with my thick thins. I like what it's doing in the table. This looks pretty good to me, except like the ranges look really great. Just overall, it's a little tight or a little loose for whatever my application is. Well, you can change it. You can use, when you turn auto density on, so let me turn it off. It's a standard density here. It's just a number, and you can change it, and it's fractional and all that good stuff. But for something thick and thin like this, we probably want to use auto. I'm going to turn that on. It's going to be using this table multiplied by this percentage. So if I need to adjust it, I can either go in and tweak all these individual values, which I suppose I could, but I can also just change this percentage. So I'm going to do something really drastic just so we can see it on screen. I'm going to go 150%. That's going to add half again the space between all the stitches. And yep, it really did, but it's still dealing with the thicks and thins. So where it's thicker, stitches are closer together. Where it is thinner, the stitches are farther apart. Well, you've got object properties that will work fairly well for you with the defaults. You now are armed with the information to go in and make those tweaks and make those changes and make those edits to adapt your designs as you need to.